Isaiah chapter 18. Since I wasn't here last week, I guess y'all were singing, but kind of as a quick reminder, chapter 18 is dealing with Ethiopia. And in the first three verses, Ethiopia is gravely threatened that Ethiopia sends ambassadors, especially dealing with Judah, making preparations for war. And they knew that if Judah fell, that would leave Assyria access to Egypt and Ethiopia. Isaiah tells these ambassadors from Ethiopia to go back home. And the reason they can go back home is because God would enter the battle. So in verses 4 through verse 7, Ethiopia's deliverance is going to turn them toward Yahweh. He says in verse 4, "For so the Lord said unto me, I will take my rest, and I will consider in my dwelling place like a clear heat upon herbs, and like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest." And so, in saying that, God is basically saying, I'm not panicking about the invasion. He is calmly waiting for the harvest to ripen, and he knows what the result's going to be, which is he's going to, or 185,000 soldiers are going to die in the night. And so he takes his rest in heaven, which is his dwelling place. That gets us to where we are in verse 5, that for the harvest, when the bud is perfect, and the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he shall both cut off the sprigs with pruning hooks, and take away and cut down the branches. So, again, God is in his resting place, waiting for everything to ripen and get to where he sets forth to destroy Assyria. Now then, what he's saying here is, before the harvest takes place, before it's completed, which the harvest in this case would be the Assyrian aggression and invasion. So before it reaches its zenith, God's going to prune Assyria. My Siri thought I said, "Hey Siri," instead of Assyria. But God's going to prune the Assyrian nation before it reaches its zenith, its climax, or what it intended. The bud is perfected is Assyrians' plans. They are on the verge of completion. Again, if they can overtake Judah, they can continue on down right into Egypt and Ethiopia. That's their plans. They have taken everything up to Jerusalem. Now then they encircle Jerusalem. Of course, we'll see later on that he sends his general telling them, you need to just give up because we're going to defeat you. So their plans overtake Jerusalem, and then continue marching right on down into Egypt and Ethiopia. The sour grape that he mentions is ripening in the flower, is that it is becoming a ripening grape. Instead of just a flower, you've got the actual, it's becoming a grape. But God's going to cut away or cut off the sprigs and take away and cut down the branches so that Assyria and their plans will be destroyed. But he does so in such a way, if you cut off the sprigs and the branches of a tree, or in this case, a grapevine, what's going to happen to it?
It's going to be unproductive, right?
Well, it's going to be unproductive, but in the application, what? The bush will die. If you cut off all of the limbs and branches, it's going to die, is the idea. And he is expressing the aspect that Assyria, any future plans that they might have, they're gone. They're destroyed. So not only is he going to stop their aggression in Jerusalem, anything really in the future, it's gone. I don't know how big their army was at the time that they encircled Jerusalem. But when you lose 185,000 soldiers in one night, you remember what they do. They turn and go home. And then 2 of his sons kill him, and another son takes the kingship. But as far as a nation is concerned that's aggressive and being able to overtake nations and really as a war machine, it's gone. God has, in this sense, cut off the sprigs, taken away and cut down the branches. So that while it's still there as a nation, there's nothing there as far as a war machine. Dale.
What does scattered field mean? Hinting at or describing people scattered in the field and like awesome is not the word from the beginning of there too.
Where are you?
It's twice used the phraseology of verses 1 through 7. It's twice used. It says scattered field in verse 2 to a people terrible or awesome from the beginning up to now, or hitherto, and they could beat it out and drop down. That's talking about Ethiopians, right?
That's talking about the Ethiopians, okay. And probably dealing with their character, their nature. So it's talking about them being scattered all over the place and field. All the field mean. I guess not get your word out. Get a commentary and read it, I guess, huh? Peeled is dealing with their smooth skin.
Oh, okay.
They are not hairy people.
Oh, okay.
So that's That's what he's dealing with there. Verse 6 then, and they shall be left together unto the fowls of the mountains and to the beasts of the earth, and the fowls shall summer upon them, and all the beasts of the earth shall winter upon them. This is dealing, he doesn't specify the number or anything. Here's the Assyrians' soldiers, those 185,000 soldiers. What happened to them? Well, they died, obviously, but what happened to their bodies? Let me put it that way. They were left out there to rot, and they became food for the fowls and the beast. They came and feasted upon them. And the idea is, again, God doesn't specify a number here, but it's so many that they can feast upon those bodies for an entire year, is the idea that he's expressing when he talks about the summer and then winter upon them. So the entire year, there's enough bodies there for them to feed upon the entire year. And again, you're dealing with such a great number that trying to bury all of them, well, number one, why would the Israelites want to bury them? And then trying to bury that many, what would you do? Well, maybe a mass grave or something, but that's about it. So they're just basically left out in the land to provide food for the animals. And in verse 7, in that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts, of a people scattered and peeled, and from a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion. The people scattered and peeled, again, you're dealing with the Ethiopians here. Now what's happening? They are bringing a present unto Yahweh, to the Lord. They have seen what God has done. You think it would take very long to get news to these other nations all around that all of this multitude of Assyrian soldiers just died in the night, and that they've run home? I think that would cause somebody to think a little bit.
That already happened once when they crossed the Jordan. The people that crossed had already heard about what they had done in Egypt, and they were scared.
Okay, when the Israelites go in to take the land in Joshua, you see that with Rahab the harlot in particular, and her comments. We've seen what you've done in Egypt. We've seen what took place during the wilderness wanderings and the lands that you conquered then, and we were afraid. Brought fear upon them. Well, now then you have this great event, and I'm saying great from the standpoint of it is a huge event, not great from the standpoint of great. It was good from the standpoint that Jerusalem was delivered, From the Assyrians, I don't guess it was too great. But as a result, though, what do the Ethiopians do? They send a present.
Should this be having references to the church also? That the rest of the people of the world will be converted?
Let me get to that in just a moment. Because a quick answer, I believe so.
One of the reactions was, as you recall, was the Gibeonites basically used a little bit of trickery to make yourself safe.
Well, that's back in the conquest of the land. That's not now that we're talking about. The Ethiopians send present or gifts to Jerusalem in God's honor. Someone turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and read verses 22 and 23. 2 Chronicles 32, verses 22 and 23.
Thus the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and from the hand of all others, and guided them on every side. And he brought gifts unto the Lord to Jerusalem, and presents to Hezekiah the king of Judah, so that he was magnified in the sight of all nations from thenceforth.
Okay, that's this event. Hezekiah is the king. Here's these nations bringing gifts. Put yourself in a king's position, and you hear about this over here in this other nation. Which would you rather be, their friend or their enemy? I think it's kind of obvious, isn't it? I don't want to attack them because I know what happened to Sennacherib and his army. So what do? They send gifts or presents. Turn over to Psalm 68 and someone read verse 31. So here's Egypt, Ethiopia. They're stretching out their hand to God. They're coming out of those lands. And then in Psalm 72 and verse 10. Psalm 72:10.
Prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended.
72:10.
Oh, 10, that's 20. Kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts.
So here's surrounding nations sending gifts, bringing presents to Jerusalem. He then describes the Ethiopians as he did in verse 2, basically the same way. Wayne Jackson wrote, "Ancient history records the fact that Judaism did make a significant impact in Ethiopia. An illustration of this fact is seen in the New Testament record of that eunuch, a Jewish devotee who was treasurer under Queen Candace of Ethiopia, Acts 8:27. There's what you were asking about. He goes on to say, ancient Ethiopia's interest in things divine, Psalm 68:32, however, is but a token of and a prelude to a greater ingathering, the universal composition of the Church of Christ. E.J. Young suggests that the prophecy denotes, quote, the turning unto the true God of all those there were and are scattered abroad the whole earth, end quote. The impact and the influence of Jerusalem was at that time a worldwide influence. There has been advanced by some. I don't agree with this position, but it has been advanced by some in the Lord's church that, yes, the patriarchal dispensation ended at Mount Sinai. And that while God gave the law to Jerusalem, or to the Israelites were to then spread that throughout the entire world. Now that's as the way in which some argue such. As I say, I don't agree with that view, but you cannot help but see the influence that Israel is to have upon the world. Again, there's the viewpoint of some, and again, I think a wrong influence or view, that God during the Old Testament only dealt with Israel. You can see that that's not the case. In fact, this entire section of Isaiah is dealing with foreign nations. Here's Ethiopia and Egypt. We're fixing to get into the burden of Egypt in chapter 19. And all of the nations that God deals with. Yet it was during the time of the Mosaic Law that he gave to Israel. Did foreign nations have prophets? Prophets from God? Can you name any? Okay, Baal. He was not an Israelite. He was not with the Israelites. Balak hired him to curse Israel. Of course, God told him don't do it. He was a prophet of God, yet he was not an Israelite. Melchizedek? Well, he wasn't a prophet, though, really, of God. For some reason, my mind said Nebuchadnezzar instead of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the priest of God and king. He was not called a prophet. But he was priest and king, but that would be before the Mosaic Law and back in Genesis chapter 14, I believe.
Archaeologists have found murals, huge murals, that it was during this time of the Syrians and different people that was on the floor, and it was showing people bowing down to what looked like an Israelite person, bringing tokens to them and stuff like that. And the Syrian people were dressed in their garbs, but they were bound down to they said it was the Israelite people, the way they were dressed, had to be. And they did pay tribute.
That would be consistent with what the Bible teaches. What about Jethro? Anybody remember Jethro? Father-in-law of Moses? Was he an Israelite? No, but he was a prophet of God, wasn't he? You have an Israelite who was sent to a certain city, and he went in, and after trying to run away, and said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed." He was an Israelite, but where did he go? He was a prophet. He was a he was a prophet to Nineveh. He tried to run away from that job of being a prophet to Nineveh, but he was a prophet to Nineveh. If they had prophets then, and prophets from God, now that's just a few instances that we know of that is recorded for us, then God was still dealing with those nations, wasn't he? Even though by the time of the New Testament, Romans 1st chapter, they had totally rejected God from a national standpoint, yet we do see the influence of the Israelites even during that period of time. So I do believe that this is not a direct prophecy of the New Testament times. I don't believe that. But I do think that there is a symbolism, maybe a little bit of typology, in the aspect that all nations would be looking to God, and at that time the God of Israel, and would thus bring presents, gifts to him, that all nations would worship God. Okay, Dale.
The phrase Mount Zion, presence of Mount Zion, the Lord of hosts. Mount Zion was used to refer to the church and the kingdom. Hebrews 12:22 and 23 and 28, and then in Galatians 4:26, the Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. They all tie in together, physically as well as spiritually, and a lot of chain reference verses if you take time to run them. Micah 4:1 and 2, and Isaiah 2:2 and 3, and all that stuff ties together.
Well, when you have Zion and Jerusalem, he's setting forth the aspect that on Mount Sinai was the giving of the law. And for example, in Isaiah 2:2 and 3, you have the law going forth from there. But in a prophetic way of dealing with the church. So you have all of that from the standpoint of the church is where the law goes forth. It's applicable to everyone, but here's where thus Jerusalem, Zion, Sinai, all of those having reference to thus the church.
Well, wouldn't Cornelius be an example of God working with fellow the Jews? Because he wasn't a prophet, but he was a follower of God.
Yes.
But he wasn't a Jew.
Yes. The Ethiopian eunuch, he was a Jew. At least I believe he was. I think all indications prove that he was. Some think that he was a proselyte to the Jewish religion. I would disagree with that, but either way, he was still considered a Jew, even though he might have been a proselyte. And just as an aside, in that, under the law of Moses, a eunuch did not have access to the temple. He was excluded from it. With the Ethiopian eunuch becoming a member of the church, you see that exclusion no longer exists. But yes, he was would have been Jewish in his nature.
I've been taught all my life he was a proselyte. He went to the Jews first, proselytes, and then to the Gentiles.
Well,
That's the way that's the way up.
in Acts 2, you will see as he lists all the nations that are there, he says Jews and proselytes. So the proselytes were there on the day of Pentecost. It was in Acts 1 and verse 8, first to Jerusalem, then Judea and Samaria, and then under the uttermost part of the earth. He was from Ethiopia, though, not Judea or Samaria. The reason that he is mentioned, number one, because of the aspect of being a eunuch, but also because he was a Jew as a result. And that's why he went to Jerusalem for to worship.
He wouldn't be a proselyte that way.
No, I don't believe that he was.
He could have been, but probably not, so to say.
That would be what I would say, yes. That there is I'm not excluding the possibility of him being a proselyte. He could be.
He was definitely interested in the Jewish way of
Well, he went to Jerusalem for to worship.
because he was reading the law and
He was reading the Isaiah. So he was a Jew from everything that I can see. Part of the dispersion of the Jews. Cornelius, on the other hand, he was a Gentile. He was not a Jew. Some have questioned whether or not Gentiles had obeyed the gospel before Cornelius. No. Cornelius was the first. How do I know that? 1, Acts 1 and verse 8, which we just mentioned. 2, why was there the need to give the house of Cornelius the gift of the Holy Spirit prior to their obedience to the gospel even?
Show that they were,
Show that who?
that the Gentiles
Okay.
were like parallel or similar to the Jews that had received the gifts in Acts 2, 1 through 14. The same.
You're going too far, Dale. It was to prove to the Jews and to everyone that the Gentiles had the right to obedience to the gospel.
Oh, okay.
That was the reason that the Holy Spirit was given.
Okay.
Or as it's mentioned in Acts 1, I think around, or Acts 10 and about verse 40, 45, maybe a little bit before that, that they received the gift of the Holy Spirit.
That was the evidence Peter used.
That was the evidence they used in Acts 11. When he was confronted, he also used it in Acts 15. That's true at the Jerusalem conference. And a third reason I know that that the house of Cornelius was first Gentile converts would be Matthew 16 and verse 19. Now what does Matthew 16:19 tell us? What does verse 18 say?
Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven.
That's verse 19. What's verse 18 say?
Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of
Okay.
hell shall not prevail against it.
I say unto thee, who? Peter. That upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. That means that he was going to go into the Hadean realm, be raised from the dead, and establish his church. Gates of Hades would not stop him from establishing the church. I will give unto thee, who? Peter, in that context, the keys of the kingdom. Thus, who do we find preaching on the day of Pentecost primarily? Peter. Who's going to take the gospel to the Gentile world then? Peter. Who goes to Cornelius' house in Acts the 10th chapter? Peter. So there's three reasons I would tell you as to Cornelius is the first Gentile convert. But he was, prior to that, just to go back to what Paul was saying, someone turn over to Acts 10 and verse 2. Because Acts 10 and verse 2 is God's description of Cornelius. And what does he say about him? Okay, he was okay. Devout man. See if you can find that term, devout man, used of anyone who's not in a right relationship with God. One that feared God. Well, go through and see about the same thing. If one fears God, what does he do? He keeps his commandments. Now, what commandments did Cornelius have? Patriarchal law. What commandments did Abraham have? Patriarchal law. Could Abraham be saved based upon his obedience to the patriarchal law?
Well, in Acts 17, 30, 31.
It was a kind of a rhetorical question because we all know that Abraham was saved based upon obedience to the patriarchal law. Then why can't Cornelius be saved based upon obedience to the patriarchal law? That's Acts 17th chapter, for one thing. Remember Acts 1 and verse 8. He gives an order of taking the gospel to the world. Did everyone in the world become amenable to the gospel of Christ on Acts 2nd chapter in Pentecost? No. It was first in Jerusalem. That means what? To the Jews, but it's only amenable to them. If it's amenable to everyone, then they should obtain the gospel to everyone immediately. Because everyone was amenable to it. Think about this for a second. Since we're on this subject, and we're not going to get into chapter 19 tonight, like I planned. You have the death of Christ. Then Acts the 2nd chapter, there's 50-day period there, right? What law? Well, first let me introduce it by, did the death of Christ take away the law of Moses?
Not yet.
Bible says that it did.
Yeah, it does.
Nailed it to the cross.
But it wasn't prophesied in Acts 2.
Just wait, Dale. You're answering something I didn't ask yet. Death of Christ nailed the old law to the cross. Then, what law were they under those 50-day period? That 50-day period, were they under any law at all? Because the law of Christ was not to go forth until Pentecost in Jerusalem.
They had to have a law. Federal law was so serious.
Well, there's the next steps in this. They had to have a law, but what law were they under? They remained under the Jewish law during that 50-day period. The law of Moses. And then on the day of Pentecost, you have the law going forth from Jerusalem. That's when the apostles were endowed of the Holy Spirit. But you have that period of time, and if you want to call it a transitional period, that's fine. I don't care. Call it whatever you want. You have a period of time after the death of Christ in which Christ nailed the law of Moses to the cross, to that period of time in which the law becomes amenable, or the law of Christ becomes amenable to first the Jews. then later on, Judea and Samaria, and then later on, according to Acts 1 and verse 8, the rest of the world. I'm saying what happened in Jerusalem, let's say, from the death of Christ to Acts 2. They remained under the law of Moses. The person under patriarchal law would have remained under that and subject to it to the time of Cornelius. And that Cornelius, prior to the law becoming applicable to him, could have been and would have been in a right relationship with God based upon his obedience to patriarchal law. Even as a Jew during that 50-day period could have remained and faithful and in a right relationship with God based on his continued obedience to the law of Moses, even though the law of Moses had been nailed to the cross. Because the application of that which took place at the cross did not take place for the Jew until Acts 2 and did not take place for the Gentile until Acts 10. Now then, that's another entire lesson that doesn't deal specifically with Isaiah, but it gets back to that of the gospel going into the world. God set forth an order. He set forth the timing of that order in which the law of Christ was going to become applicable to the world. Now then, lest anyone misunderstand, that situation applies to no one today. Because from the time of, I'd just say Acts the 10th chapter, everyone in the world became amenable to the law of Christ. And that's why almost immediately after that you see the gospel being taken into the entire world with the missionary work of Paul. So no one is under that type of a situation today, because everyone's under the law of Christ today. You had in that time frame, you have a, use that word, transitional period in which you're changing from, you have two laws that are applicable to people. For the Jews, the law of Moses. For the Gentiles, the patriarchal law. Yeah, they're waiting on there out there. So, and you have a time frame there in which the law of Christ is becoming applicable to them. So we'll stop there.